that, and I'll also there. So let me. Okay, so right. So that's streaming properly. So what we'll now do is we will do our little. We'll do our little start. So here we go. Just always nice to give it a counting. Good. Oops. Okay. There we go. There's me again.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that. That's terrible. I've just realized. So in fact, I'm going to be a bit sneaky here. I've got the wrong passage here. So I'm just going to edit down at the bottom. I can cut this out when the video goes up. But so actually we're doing Matthew 11, verse 2 through to 19. So
yeah, just a reminder for people to mute so we don't get people coming in.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So there you go. That was a rather clumsy start. But let's come back here. Let's go. Where are we? So on here. There we go. So now we do a good start. So we'll do our welcome. So welcome everybody. There's just a handful of us today. Which, as we're just saying, it's not surprising when you've taken a bit of an extended break over Easter. It takes a bit of time to get some momentum going. And as you just watched me editing the passage that we're looking at, we're actually looking at Matthew 11. We're looking at 2 to 19 today, which is quite a long passage. And it's a passage that if we had hours and hours, you could kind of dive in on lots of different points. So my apologies. In many ways, what we're going to do is look at a slightly high, but not slightly high, at a kind of overview level, which sometimes it's useful to do that, though, rather than to go quickly diving in too deep to kind of get a sense of the flow. So hopefully it will work like that. So we're going to, the passage we're looking at covers Jesus's testimony to John the Baptist. I was just flagging to Barbara that I'm just at the moment putting together. We're doing an evening teaching program that starts next week, 3 weeks, where we're looking at John the Baptist. So to kind of give some context before we get into the text, it really struck me as I proposed that we would do John the Baptist because I felt there was more there, but it started to really strike me how very often we talk about how John has come to prepare the way for Jesus and so on, but then apart from the baptism, it seems like he doesn't seem to do very much. But if you're very, very careful and you kind of pick out the various references through the gospel, you see actually there is a far more significant sense of his preparation. And when you look at history, you realize that John has a massive impact, which is just not really spelt out for us in the Gospels. And I suspect there is something of Jesus's success which God has achieved through the sending of John. So we talk about his preparing the way for him. And then we hear about the crowds coming around Jesus and getting more than John had. And John only kind of really turns up on the scene about a year before Jesus does. So it's not like it's a long period, but there's something about his message that is already getting people to start to think and to hope. So when Jesus turns up on the scene, he is now he's already a step up in terms of where he wants to go. So just as a kind of a quick throw out to kind of give a sense, the disciples of John, we encounter them in the Gospels, but actually they exist for a very, very long time. In fact, they exist to this day. There are still 70,000 disciples of John. They're called the Mandians. They may die out, or Mandaeans. They may die out in the next couple of generations, because for a long time they existed in Iraq. But in all of the troubles that have been there, they've dispersed all around the world. So whether they will survive, I don't know. That said, they're not really Christian. They're much more like a Gnostic mystic religion now. But actually that same group has a continuity. They're referenced 3 times in the Quran. The Quran refers to them, which of course is 6th or 7th century, 6th century. It refers to them as the Sabaeans, and it puts them alongside Christians and Jews as being in the way that the Quran sees them as being religions of the book that should be respected. So actually you have, for centuries after Jesus, you still have John the Baptist's disciples, and they become quite resistant to the Christian gospel. So if you actually look in their scriptures, you'll find things where Jesus is being criticized, not contemporary, of course, they come much later, as being a Roman religion, for instance. But it kind of illustrates how wide John's ministry had affected, which is quite phenomenal, really. And so he plays a very important role, and he also kind of frames Jesus' life. Obviously, he's there in the womb when Mary turns up, who's now conceived by the Holy Spirit, and he testifies to that by leaping in the womb. And then of course he's there at the baptism of Jesus, and at the baptism of Jesus there is, if you like, an event which more clearly illustrates the Trinity than any other event in the Bible. Because obviously, there is Jesus as the Son, and then the Spirit descends, and it's the voice of the Father out of heaven. This is my Son, that is declaring. So you have the most, if you like, precise event-driven testimony to Trinity. So he's there at the incarnation. He's there. There's this kind of expression of Trinity. Of course, he anoints Jesus for ministry, baptizes him, and so on. But then, of course, he also prophesies about the one who's coming after will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And Jesus actually takes that prophetic quote, and he actually he revisits it at his ascension, just as Jesus is about to ascend at the beginning of the book of Acts. And he says to go and wait for what was prophesied through John, for the Holy Spirit, you see. So actually John has testified and prophesied Pentecost. So he's a very significant character. And at this moment here, as we kind of work through Matthew, we're going to have Jesus's testimony to it. And the thing that causes it is John is in prison. So here's the words. Now, John, having heard in prison of the things that the Christ was doing, he sent two of his disciples to ask him and said, are you whom was to come, or should we look for another? And it's a kind of a challenging question, because it tells something of John's emotional state. But remember that John had stepped out in ministry. He'd done what he needed to do, guided by the Holy Spirit. But when Jesus presents himself to baptism, he suddenly realizes that Jesus is the person he's been doing what he's doing to prepare the way for. But he has known Jesus before that. They're related. So to some level, they probably had some level of connection since childhood. We also pick up in John's gospel that Jesus has acted as a quite senior figure within John's movement. That's often a surprise to people, but in John's gospel, John's disciples come and say, he who was with you before. They don't say he who was with us. So Jesus's role within John's movement is higher than his senior disciples, those who have most access to him. And they recognize there was something about Jesus when John was ministering that was still at a higher level. He was alongside. So he's gone through a moment where growing up, he's not really understood the role of Jesus. He's suddenly seen it with clarity at the baptism. He's given the space to Jesus within his ministry. But now, as he is in prison, he's doubting what's going on. And we can speculate on that. We'll do that more next week. I won't go into it now. I say next week, not next week at lunchtime in this Bible study, but in the evening sessions I'm doing on John the Baptist. But he's running through this kind of doubt situation. Have I got it right? Part of what I'm going to touch on is there were various Messianic expectations which John must have become familiar with. He knows that his ministry is to prepare the way for the coming of God, which probably is tied in with the Messiah. And he's looked at the various texts and the expectations, and you can read those in, for instance, the Qumran scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls, in the intertestamental literature, where they have an expectation for how the Messiah will come. And now, as he's there, he's not seeing Jesus do the things that perhaps he's expected in the flesh. And that's often something we've got to get hold of, is with the prophetic characters. there is a kind of an element to their flesh which is somehow superseded. When I say somehow, it's not difficult to understand, by the Spirit in them, that they prophesy beyond what their natural expectations are. And here is John not able to kind of pursue his ministry, but stuck in prison and now left just with who he is in the natural. And he's got all this learning that says the Messiah should do this, the Messiah should do that, and he's asking questions about it. So should we look for another? And so Jesus replies and says, you go back and tell John the things which you hear and see. So blind people are looking up. You'll often see that as translated as received their sight. The actual Greek is up looking, which probably does mean receive their sight, but I quite like the idea of blind people's kind of eyes are looking up. Lame people walk, lepers are cleansed, deaf people hear, and dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. So he gives that this little kind of list of things which are associated with the Messiah, but aren't necessarily the things that the Messiah was expected to do in terms of, if you like, rallying an army. We know from Josephus that the reason that Herod Antipas was nervous of John the Baptist is that John would have been able to raise a massive army had he wanted to. So there's clearly something in the way John has anticipated the Messiah, which has surprised him when it's turned up. And now when he's feeling low, it's hard to really hold on to. So Jesus clarifies it's not about some of those earthly expectations, some of which about being a conquering Messiah or about the second coming, but that's something we haven't got our heads around yet. It's still developing in terms of the revelation of what's to come. And so he pushes those words back to John, which John, as he meditates on them, will understand, yes, these really are the signs of you being the Messiah. And then Jesus finishes with and blessed is he who in me shall not fall away. And I sometimes think about that phrase because actually the in Christ is something that Paul picks up as an idea, but this seems to me to be a first expression of the idea of the people that Jesus is gathering are now in him. They are kind of very clearly a part of him. So there's something there which I don't want to kind of try and speculate on too much. I haven't really got my head fully kind of around it. But right here at this point where Jesus is articulating, there's something about what he's doing. So in many ways, their messages are very similar, but they could mean very different things. John preaches, behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Jesus preaches, behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But actually, from that moment on, Jesus starts to redefine people's understanding of what the kingdom really is. And so probably with John, there's a little bit of a mismatch, not because there's anything wrong with him, but because Jesus is doing something so radically new, he couldn't fully anticipate it. And part of that, there's something about being in Jesus. So now as they were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. So he said, what did you go out to the wilderness to see? A windswept reed? No, there's obviously something. He wasn't a bashed around character. He wasn't a small character. He stands in a tradition that actually has garnered an awful lot of respect. So again, if we look at the large amount of text that Josephus writes about John the Baptist, far more than he writes about Jesus, Josephus actually tells us about the three sects, the three major sects. He says there are lots of sects in Judaism. Three major sects are the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he tells us about how they came about. And then he talks about the Essenes, who sort of in reaction to them, who are out in the desert. And he speaks with a lot of kind of, and he talks about how they seem to him to be the best. And he likes this kind of wilderness living. And then he tells a story about how, separate from the Essenes, he spent some time as a young man living in the wilderness, living off wild food, which is very similar to John the Baptist, and what an important experience it was. But he kind of gets across the idea that this is something that a lot of ordinary folks admire as they look into it. This sort of wilderness living approach that John represents. You see, therefore, some of the way he matches their expectations and draws on that as they come towards him. And and again, what do you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? Question mark from Jesus. So we're told that John wore camel hair. We often think of that as being like a rough kind of almost like the aesthetics. It's uncomfortable. Interestingly, from a historical point of view, this is the earliest reference to a style of clothing that was made by the Bedouins for over 1,000 years. It's been made because it turns out that camel hair is brilliant if you live out in the desert. It's kind of like you twist it and you make wool with it. And when it gets wet, it kind of expands and fuses in a way which now actually becomes water resistant, but is very easy for air to pass through. So the Bedouins for 1,000+ years have made camel hair overgarments. So when it tells us about John wearing a camel hair kind of cloak or whatever, yeah. I can't remember what the Greek word is for it. It's not so much that it's something that's rough. It's something that those who lived out in the desert find very practical. But of course, it ties into Elijah, who dresses similarly, of course. And so Jesus makes reference to that because you went out, he represented something for you. Here he is in the desert. And so, as I say, this is actually probably the earliest written reference to this style of clothing, which we know about now. And has been produced for a good 1,000-odd years because it's waterproof, allows air to pass through so you don't get too hot, because very often waterproof materials trap the air in as well, and then you get, of course, you die of dehydration in the desert. So very practical. But it's not considered to be fine wear. It's quite rough, but it's very useful. So those who wear finery, they're in king's palaces. It wasn't that you went out to see. So what did you go out to see? Answering the question, Jesus says, well, of course, it was a prophet. Yeah. And in fact, I'm going to tell you, he was more than a prophet. So he's looked the prophet's part. He's looked like Elijah in his camel hair. But he wasn't someone big and important. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a rich man, but you recognize him as a prophet. And now I'm saying he's actually more than a prophet. It's Jesus' testimony of him. So this is he about whom it was written. And we're very familiar with this, but here's Jesus declaring it to everybody else. It's, behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare the way before you. And he's quoting here from Malachi and also from Exodus, but it then blends into passage in Isaiah as well, because actually the idea of this messenger who comes before actually starts in the book of Exodus. It might seem odd, but in Exodus, when the angel goes before them, the Hebrew word for an angel is a messenger. He's a messenger. So when it says, I will send a messenger before you, in Exodus, actually that phrase is then paralleled by Isaiah when he talks about a messenger who's going to come to prepare the way, and again in Malachi. So all of those things. So from the very beginning of the Bible, sort of, Exodus is book number 2, the middle of the Bible, Isaiah, and at the end of the Old Testament, Malachi, we've had this idea of the messenger who's going before you, popping up. And Jesus draws with these words all of those things into play in people's minds. He is that person that the Old Testament was talking about all the way through. So I'm telling you, among those who are born of women, there has arisen no one who's greater than John the Baptist. Albeit, regarding that, or despite that, even the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And that's a strong statement and shows something of the transition that's kind of going on at the moment. That John has come declaring the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's close. It's nearly here. And now here is Jesus saying nobody was better anticipated. No one is more important. No one is greater than John. With the mission he's been doing in preparing a way, which Jesus is now the fulfillment of, but it's not clear to everyone yet, including the messenger, that Jesus is. And now it's coming into relief. And Jesus is starting to say explicitly, there's something now beginning to happen where even the least now in that kingdom that he came prophesying is pushing its way in, but it's not yet here. It's now beginning to arrive, and even the least in that is going to be greater than John is. So from the days of John the Baptist up to now. So there's a very tight little phrase. From the days of John the Baptist, just a few years ago when he started, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, and the violent lay claim to it. And here we suddenly get this tension, which is probably what that John is struggling with in prison, which is if you look at the rabbinic writings and their expectations of the Messiah have this thing of violence around it. And so even the language of the kingdom of heaven and what God has been talking about wanting to do all the way through has been understood in terms of an us v them and conflict narrative. So actually from even the days when John the Baptist started to teach the kingdom of heaven is at hand and got people excited and starting to pay attention, which paved the way for when Jesus' ministry came to them to notice what was going on and get drawn into it. But there's something that Jesus is needing to turn over, because up to now, it's been there has been a kind of an assumption of aggression, an assumption of a certain type of dominance, political dominance, military dominance, and the violent lay claim to it, or the violent take it by force or seize it by force, as we sometimes translate it. That are looking in the commentaries, it is all the idea that it's something about that mindset that kind of has hijacked this biblical language of the kingdom of heaven and turned it into something which is about us beating them and being on the top of the pile. And so Jesus is saying, even from the days when he was preaching until now, that's the way we've done it. And all of the prophet and the law prophesied up until John, they were talking about the kingdom of heaven. But actually, there's something now that we're going to turn it over. Then it's a slight change, because Jesus says, but if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. So he who has ears to hear, let him hear. I've not fully in my mind worked out exactly why Jesus says this, so I feel being a bit fuzzy today. But because I can't say definitively. Some of these things are kind of that we can only speculate on them. But I do think that Jesus is turning around the expectation of all of these words that are about the kingdom. So it's not a military kingdom anymore. My kingdom's not of this world. Even from the days of John the Baptist up until now, up until this point, where you're going to start seeing the kingdom of heaven looks very, very different. And here's one of the differences between Jesus' ministry and John the Baptist's ministry. And I say this not in any kind of critical sense, it's just an observational sense that when John has come up out of the wilderness, people have come to him. One of the things that is different in the way that Jesus ministers, and so they have come to him as an expert. So in one sense, he sits at the top of a hierarchy of expertise. And right from the beginning, Jesus doesn't baptize, he gets other people to baptize. So he's already giving ministry away, significant ministry away. And then after John's arrest, Jesus, instead of being in one place and people coming to him, starts to itinerate to meet them in their own towns. And there is, if you like, a subtle difference that is already beginning to kind of appear in the style of ministry that Jesus is doing, that is turning the hierarchy kind of on its head. It's not about kind of reaching up. It is about something undergirding that is infecting and spreading. So Jesus' ministry is different. He travels to where people are. He gives away ministry rather than holds on to it. And yes, there'll be people who gather to him, but he's wanting to demonstrate something different. So the little phrase is, he who's got ears to hear, let him hear, which is Jesus, in one sense, acknowledging you need to think deeper about this if you're really going to understand it. Which is therefore not surprising that I'm saying as we go through. I'm not 100% sure, because some of it has its effect in us because we try and mull it over. What did Jesus mean? How does that work? If we just knew it straight up front, it wouldn't go deeper into us. But it's as we engage around sometimes those difficult words that we kind of see things deeper. So then Jesus makes a really interesting statement, and we're nearly at the end of the actual text. So he says, so then what can I compare this to this generation? It's like children who sit in the markets and call out to others saying, we piped for you and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge and you didn't lament. Because John came and he was neither eating nor drinking. Just a quick comment on that he wasn't eating or drinking. You remember that Gabriel says to Zacharias in the temple, you're going to have a son, and he won't he'll be dedicated to the Lord from his mother's birth, and he won't drink strong drink. And we tend to, when we read that, we tend to think of it in terms of the Nazarene vow, Nazarite vow, where you'd commit yourself for a period not to drink. But actually, one of the things we miss is that actually, as a priest going up to the altar, Zacharias would have abstained. As you went into the presence of God, as you went into the Holy of Holies, which Zacharias is doing, he's chosen by lot, probably the only time in his life he gets to go in. He abstains from strong drink. He doesn't take wine or alcohol. So that has allowed him to go into the presence of the Lord as part of the conditions. So the statement is less about the kind of commitment of keeping a vow. It's more as a statement of, actually, just as you've done this to come into my presence, there's something about John that's going to be in my presence. So that's why he's probably not a drinker. Neither eating. Well, we know that John is living this lifestyle based on food that it's probably not exclusive, but on the whole, he's tending to sustain himself by locusts and wild honey, both of which are available in the desert. Interestingly, the Jordan Valley was actually, Josephus actually tells us it swarms with bees. It's incredibly fertile for honey production. So as you come down to the wilderness, no doubt there was still places where you could get wild honey, where John is. But anyway, he makes that point. So it's clear by John's lifestyle, he's someone who doesn't eat, he doesn't drink. And actually you look at him and say, well, he's obviously got a demon. And then he says, but then the Son of Man, i.e. me, comes eating and drinking. And then you look at this one and say, look at this man, he's a glutton and a wine bibber, friend of tax collectors and sinners. And then this little phrase, which actually captures something else that Jesus says elsewhere. He says, but wisdom is vindicated by her offspring. You'll see that's translated different ways in different translations. Sometimes you'll see it says children. Wisdom is vindicated by her children, and others will say by her deeds. And the reason for that is that the various texts have they're slightly varied in the Greek. One's saying deeds or actions, and the other talking about children. But it's not complicated to see. Jesus isn't speaking in Greek, although the Gospels come to us in Greek. So he's presumably he's using a word which is the outflow. And the outflow of my thinking is normally understood as an action. If I think about doing something, I do it. See, so it's what flows out of. So in one sense, what Jesus just kind of said is captured perhaps slightly clearer for us to understand when he says, you don't collect thorns, you don't collect fruit from thorn bushes, or I can't remember, I can't get the quote right exactly. But and then he says, but a tree by its fruit. You don't get bad fruit from a good tree, and vice versa. So actually, what he's saying here is wisdom is vindicated by her offspring, i.e. the things that flow out of her. That there was a common wisdom. It looked different in John to me, but there are good things coming out of both. But you have looked at the external, and in both cases, you've decided that there's something wrong with it. And actually, there's a kind of an interesting kind of there's an interesting challenge in that, which I think is a really, really important one. Which is, there's an awful lot of criticism that still goes on in the Christian church of people who do it this way, people who do it that way. And actually, the key thing to be looking at is what is the impact, what is the fruit? And it is tough. It really is tough sometimes when you see things that do things that you can see there's a good reason why they shouldn't have done it that way, but somehow God's produced good out of it. And what that challenged me to do is to understand, because there's something like this going on here. John is not perfect in his prophetic ministry. He's a normal, fallible person. In particular, he's not yet into the kingdom. He's still doing it in cooperation with the Holy Spirit, but without the indwelling of the Holy Spirit that might give you a chance at putting together those insecurities in life. But he's trying to do it in his way. And there's something that as God looks at him, he understands, and actually God is able to produce good fruit out of a good heart. And it's a really important kind of challenge and a good thermometer to remember that actually it's not always the externals. Yes, there are elements to which we can sometimes use as an excuse and produce bad externals and say, yeah, but I produce good fruit. Well, is it really good or not? I don't know. But that key kind of question, is God being glorified out of this, or is he being run down? I've also, the flip side, I've known really good people whose actions have done things that bring the Lord's name into disrepute. And actually you have to ask the question, you see, just because someone is a good person doesn't always mean the things they're doing are good. But actually, how do you mix it all together? I'm probably confusing folks more, but that's because it is one of those things as you do life. How do you mix these wisdom? The key thing perhaps wanted to get across here is this little phrase, but wisdom is vindicated by her offspring, is really that kind of equivalent. It's what flows out. What is the impact? John did what he did in his and he did it in his way, and it produced a sense, not just a sense, but it produced actions in people. So for instance, we know from Josephus that John saw baptism as being, if you like, not the start of a journey, but the expression of someone who really has already committed themselves. So if you've really committed yourself, then I'll allow you to be baptized. So it was not the same, which is why John the Baptist is called the Baptist. Although there are lots of Jews and even the Essenes who have washing practices, they were part of the ritual of purity. But for John, it was much more, this is a visible sign. It's a prophetic sign that I want something more. But it is performed by those who are already producing fruit, if I can put it that way. So he challenged them to produce the fruit, and then he baptizes them as a prophetic sign of perhaps God finishing what they can't do. Whereas normally it was much more, well, as I'm kind of keeping how righteous I am, I'm doing washing ceremonies at the same time. So I feel I haven't been particularly clear today, but hopefully I've kind of touched on, there is a stack of things going on here which are very tied to the history of Judaism, of Israel, and what I'm still toying with in my own head is just how the ministry of John is so key in laying a foundation, probably in the hearts of the individuals, because it talks in Malachi, in a verse that's related to John, he turns the hearts of the fathers to look again to the children. It's not so much that his actions do it, but somehow the interaction with who he is and his message starts to prepare people for when Jesus turns up, to have their understanding of what the kingdom is going to be transformed and changed. They've always desired a kingdom. John gets them halfway. Jesus now completes the journey. So that's probably all I want to say at this stage. But does anyone want to ask any questions or get me to clarify what I've been rather fuzzy on? Anyone want to ask?
Could you just going back to when John was in prison and when he was the Messianic Expectations, you talked about perhaps a more military style of Messiah. But was that basically what it was, or were there other expectations?
Yes. So particularly, for instance, I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there is a famous scroll in the Dead Sea, which is only a single page, and it has 4 kind of messianic figures in it. Now they themselves are composites of how people split down verses that seem significant. So the scribes have kind of gone through and saw a lot of verses that seem to be about something that's coming. Sometimes they look priestly, sometimes they look military, sometimes they look prophetic, and they had tried to work out how many figures are here. So a single Messiah had become 3 sort of Messiahs, if I can put it that way, and a prophet. And the prophet sometimes was considered to be a 4th Messiah. Now, as Christians, we see a lot of those figures, that a lot of the features seem to draw into the character of Jesus. Interestingly, because I don't want to make it even more complicated or confusing, if you wrap Jesus and John together, then you can see them kind of even more closely packed in. So you remember they come and say, "Are you? Who are you?" They say to Jesus, don't they? "Are you the prophet?" So the prophet is one of those messianic figures, based on the fact that Moses has said that there would be a prophet that comes after him, and you're supposed to listen to him. So there was an expectation of a coming prophet in this kind of messianic framework, who would produce a radical new understanding of the law of Moses and produce new laws. And actually, we see that achieved or expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, which I've kind of touched on before, in the way that Jesus radically reinterprets the law of Moses, and he frames it with his 8 blessings. In the end of the giving of the law, there are 8 blessings kind of pronounced. So Jesus, in one sense, is fulfilling that prophetic understanding of what it means, the prophetic Messiah. Then there was a Messiah that was understood to be coming from the northern tribes of Israel, sometimes referred to as the Messiah from Aaron, the Messiah from Joseph. There was a Messiah who was actually a son of Joseph. Now, interestingly, Jesus has a father who is Joseph. He's not from the northern tribes. That was one of the phrases used. Sometimes he's referred to as the Messiah from Ephraim, Ephraim being one of Joseph's sons. So there's an Ephraimite Messiah who was actually the son of Joseph, a son of Joseph from that line. So there were things that there were prophecies that seemed to be associated with him. There was also a priestly Messiah. So there was a Messiah, son of Aaron. See, these are all separate from the Messiah, son of David. You see what I'm driving at, and you can find them written about. And the Messiah, son of Joseph, actually is a failing Messiah. He's a Messiah who gets beaten. That is because for instance, the suffering servant text would be understood as belonging to him. So he's not the winning Messiah, but he comes before the son of David, and so on. Now we understand in Jesus a first coming and a second coming, if you like. And it's not so much defeat, it's actually part of the victory, and so on. But these were the kinds of things that got wrapped around it. But the ultimate that often we think of when we say they're expecting Messiah, is what people were really looking for was the Davidic Messiah, who was like David was a man of bloodshed, a man of warfare, but he beat all the enemies. And that's what people's hearts were most after. And that's why I'm saying, so probably John the Baptist has absorbed those things, because he knows he's preparing the way in the best thinking of the best rabbis of the time, as you look at what their expectations are, which is perhaps why he doesn't fully understand who Jesus is until the moment of baptism, when he realizes this must be the person. But now, as time goes on and he's in prison, and Jesus isn't kind of pulling together the army that he could have pulled together, according to Josephus, if he'd wanted to. So how's this messiahship working? So I'm just saying, in a very real human level, you can sort of understand how he's stuck in that position. So
yeah, that's helpful. So do you think he was thinking of one particular aspect, or was he sort of?
So I think that because the other thing, just to make it more complicated, is that the messenger is normally presented in terms of is not explicitly coming before the Messiah, he's coming before the presence of God. And that was another aspect, you see, that gets drawn together. And we understand now from our position looking back through Jesus as Son of God and in his divinity. But actually, if you look at the prophecies about the messenger who comes to prepare the way, it's to prepare the way of the Lord, and God's presence is coming into that context. So I suspect that John is trying to be obedient to a calling, but actually there's a lot of, he doesn't yet have the clarity in his humanity. He gets it right when he's been guided and led by the Holy Spirit to do what he does, but as he's sitting there stuck in prison, he's kind of he's surrounded by all of the thinking and so on that belongs to the day he's born into.
Yes, I wondered if he felt like if Jesus was the real Messiah, that he shouldn't end up in prison. That I did wonder.
That's right. I think that's part of it, or that he'd been busted out by now.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah.
Which you can understand. I mean,
yeah, you can. Yeah,
it's a very
absolutely.
human way of thinking, oh, if God was with me, this wouldn't be happening to me.
This wouldn't be happening. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yep. Good.
Thank you.
No, it's not a problem. Does anyone else want to ask anything? No. So I will.
So much ground that you have covered, Kristen, that really, a lot of which from the passages that we are very familiar with. It really needs to go back. I really need to go back and try again to understand these things with a bit more vision and understanding, so that I can get to grips with some of the detail that is there that you've spoken of, which hasn't occurred to me in that way up to now. So I think I haven't got anything to say, because it's just so much I realise I don't know.
No, but I think the wonderful thing is, John, that the way that God has spoken is the stories you can get hold of as a child, but you can keep going deeper as you get older and older.
Yeah.
So I never want. I'm always woefully aware of what I don't now know. And yet people kind of say, oh, I didn't realize that you just told us. And I think that probably there's no end to how deep you can go. And the good thing about that is, I think the real spiritual fruit is that as we engage with the words and we think about them, the Spirit kind of answers us in ways that actually transform us and change us. So it's not always necessarily that we've alighted on the final right answer, but actually as we see the depths and we try to ask the questions, that we give permission for the Spirit to kind of lead us and shape us. That's how I like to see it anyway.
That's good.
I noticed in verse 6, I've got about blessed is he who is not offended in me, but you didn't translate it like that.
You should not fall away. Yeah, so the word is stumble. So they've kind of they've taken it as kind of the stumbling is, it's kind of an offense. It's kind of, you see how the words connect. So I went for this. Some translations do have the fall away, and some go for things like offended. But that's what the Greek. Yeah, the Greek is a word that is about stumbling. But it can be used because you're causing me to stumble because you're offending me. So they've translated it that way. And I think that I don't think John is really offended, but he's there's something about as his eyes are looking, should we be looking for somebody else? You can feel him kind of stumbling and groping in those things.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Well, we've as usual taken much longer than the half hour that I was intended that we should do in these things. So I will, if it's okay, I will dive out and go and get some soup, and then and I'm teaching tomorrow all day at another church kind of group. And then I'll be putting together, I'll try and get myself kind of clearer on my thinking on John before we start the program in a week's time. So it's quite useful to have a kind of rehearsal today, a kind of practice run to see what it is I need to think about deeper. Good. Right. So I will say goodbye then, folks.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Christian.
Yeah. See you then, everyone. So,
Okay, bye now.
Bye. Bye.